Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our next webinar. We're going to do introductions. We're just waiting. People are still quickly joining. So give us 1 second and we're going to get started. We know this is a pretty important topic to our community, so we will be recording this and sharing after the fact. And we will also make sure that if you need contact information, we'll happily provide that as well. Okay, I think I'm going to get started just because we have so much to get through today. So first of all, we'd like to thank you for joining us. Today we have Arash Tagvi, did I say it right?
Yeah.
Who is from Apollo Cannabis Clinics. And this company reached out to us to offer their information and expertise around cannabis and use for people living with ALS. So we have decided to go ahead and do this presentation because it is very much a topic of interest in our community. By no means are we encouraging people to take cannabis. It is really a listen and learn information session. We know there will be a lot of questions, and we have presented a lot of ALS specific information to you today to speak about. But also, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. At the end of the presentation, we will make sure that we address those. If they are very specific questions to your specific condition, we're going to ask you to reach out to the company directly, where we can make sure that you're connected with the right people. More of today is general information. So I'm going to go ahead and let you kind of do a little bit of introduction and make sure that everyone knows who you are.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. Yeah. So as mentioned, my name is Arash, and I am one of the international medical graduates that works at the Apollo Cannabis Clinics. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, so proud Canadian kid, and I went to most of my medical school was completed in the States. So I spent a significant amount of time in Atlanta, Georgia, and I also did a couple of rotations, my elective rotations in Cook County Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. So that is where I was before I moved to Toronto. So that's a little bit about me. When you graduate medical school, you got to put in your time into the community and you have to build up your resume, and then you apply for residency, and that's kind of where I am at now. So I work closely with all of the healthcare professionals at Apollo, and I also work very closely with the research department. We have several ongoing research projects at Apollo, and that's something I'm going to discuss as I go. So without further ado, I'll start the presentation. And as Kim had mentioned, if you have questions, put them into the question box. I encourage questions. The more, the better, I think. And obviously, I'll take them up again.
What? A webinar on Thursday with your pals.
Okay, so I'm going to get started, guys. First and foremost, who is Apollo? Apollo was a research institution that started in 2013 from a group of pain management physicians that were running out of treatment options for the patients that they were treating. They would have to say, Mr. or Mrs. Smith, I'm sorry, I no longer have any other protocol to treat the condition that you are suffering from. And the patients turned back to the healthcare professionals and asked them, well, what about medical cannabis? This is something that I approve, this is something that I am interested in, and let's give it a shot. And the doctors got together and they recognized that they knew very little about medical cannabis. And they thought, well, let's research a small group of chronic pain patients to see what benefits we can find. And they monitored them very closely. And they started with, the very entry level products for medical cannabis. And they saw very, very good results very early on. And the group started to kind of communicate that to the people around them. And they went from a small group of 30 to 60, then to 120, and then it became exponentially larger. So the research institution was converted into a cannabis clinic inadvertently. They didn't really plan it that way, but they had no other choice with the number of patients that were coming in. They had to dedicate a nurse, dedicate a couple of doctors just to that patient base. So we now have, this number is a bit dated, we have well over 50,000 patients rostered in our EMR. We do see patients coast to coast, all over Canada. We have a team of physiatrists, anesthesiologists, we have pain specialists, we have a psychiatrist. Mental health is a very big issue at Apollo, and that's something we address all the time. And of course, we have family doctors, and we have academics and researchers that follow all of the information. So, as I'm sure a lot of people in this audience will know, medical cannabis is kind of new, and it has a lot of interest towards it, and a lot of people are gravitating towards it to see if it can benefit them. But what we have to do as medical professionals is pay attention to the information, because we all know that collecting retrospectively or proactively for research is just as important as the treatment options that we give patients on a daily basis. So as mentioned, we've been involved in a lot of research projects. The current pandemic has slowed down a few, of course, since we have had to have some distance put between us and our patients. But we have been doing research since 2013, as mentioned. We've been published for PTSD with the use of medical cannabis, and we have a couple other papers that I can't speak too much on because they are still in peer-to-peer review. But again, that is where we started. That is our foundation, and it's something that's very important to the fabric of Apollo, because without knowledge and information about what you are doing, it's sometimes shooting in the dark. And we fully understand that when it comes to this medication, sometimes the dosing is us trying to learn. But what we promise our patients is we will follow, we will learn, and we will understand what can help them. So that brings us to our patients. Medical cannabis comes with a level of stigma to it. We all know that. And we have to counsel other physicians or other institutions about it all the time. People think when you go to a medical cannabis clinic, well, you're going to be stepping into a place that has, some slow playing music, a lot of snacks in the background, people are laughing a lot. And guys, I'm going to make it very clear that is not the case. We are a doctor's office like any other. We have a waiting room, we have consultation rooms, and we have education rooms. So it's very regimented, and you would be surprised the amount of people that walk in there wondering if there's something going to be out of the ordinary. But again, it is just the doctor's office. Oh, and also worth mentioning on this slide, when it comes to our patient base, the epidemiology, the reports, the numbers have come back since the legalization of recreational cannabis in 2017, which is what kind of started the trend for medical cannabis as well. Interestingly enough, medical cannabis has been legal since 2001. Recreational cannabis became legal in 2017. So medical cannabis has almost got 20 years behind it, but everybody thinks, well, 2017 is when the leaf was turned. That's not the case. It's just when it became more popular. So our patient demographics now, with the new numbers that have come back to us since 2017, shows that the age category of 18 to 35 for the use of cannabis has not changed. It's the 65 and over audience, crowd, demographic, whatever you want to call them, that has gone up exponentially. And again, it is a treatment option for many people who suffer from chronic conditions. And that's why I think that that age group is looking more towards an alternative with medical cannabis as opposed to the traditional treatments. So our medical process, I wanted to make sure that I went over this quickly just so people understood. There's, again, a lot of mystery when it comes to medical cannabis and medical cannabis clinics. Why is there a clinic that is dedicated to just one medication? Well, that's because a lot goes into it. First and foremost, we'll start at the top, step one. When anybody comes to Apollo, whether it's virtually, over the phone, or in person when we were open before the pandemic, they must go through what is called a triage. That is designed for us to attain all your past medical history, the current reason you're looking to use medical cannabis, and the current list of medications and any other information that the physician would like to have before consulting for medical cannabis. Step two is your doctor's appointment, right? This is where you will have a consultation with a healthcare professional. They will go over all things that you need to know and ensure a safety profile is in place for that individual. Step three is the medical document. This is your prescription. The prescription must go to what is called a licensed producer. There are about 350 of them in Canada now. Licensed producers are just basically your pharmacies. We do not choose one or the other. We will send the prescription or the medical document wherever the patient wishes. Now, most people come to clinic and have no idea what a licensed producer is, so we explain it. These are companies that have approval from Health Canada to grow medical cannabis, and we can send a doctor's prescription to them to give you access for medical cannabis. And again, that's all an LP is. Once a licensed producer is chosen, we go to step five. And this is where Apollo's bread and butter is. This is what we're really proud of. We spend a lot of time with our patients. We fully educate them on what to expect when using CBD, what to expect if using THC, and everything in between that can happen between side effects or help with the condition. All of this stuff is discussed. And again, that's what an education entitles. After the education, it's important to know that the medication will be sent directly to the patient's door. We are inadvertently contactless. Right? The medication comes from the licensed producer directly to the patient's home. That is a registered address. And as I present to you now, that is the only legal way to attain medical cannabis. If ever you come across a clinic that is giving you cannabis in the clinic, that is illegal. So again, just so you understand, the medication must be sent in the mail. Licensed producers, I've added this slide just so people have a better understanding. Again, these are Health Canada approved state-of-the-art facilities. These guys have positive airway pressure in large warehouses and greenhouses. They're amazing to experience if you ever have the opportunity. You step into a facility and you're hit with a warm air, it's almost tropical, and then you close the door and there's a whole bunch of people in white jumpsuits. Again, it's to keep everything sterile and to keep out contaminants. They have licenses to grow the plant, which they can turn into oils, capsules, sprays. Nowadays, they also do vape cartridges and edibles. And again, I'll discuss all the different methods of consumption when we get there. I was a little off about my number. I apologize, guys. I said about 350. I guess the marketing team's updated that for me. It's about 380. Needless to say, there are many options when it comes to medical cannabis. So we try to clarify that. We have a list of top 10 or top 15 licensed producers that we really like, and that number and those ratings have come from our patients to us. If someone says to me, hey, you know what, I tried this licensed producer, they were really quick with their shipping and they were excellent in understanding what I needed, well then guess what? They're gonna get bumped up in our list because I know that a patient has had a positive experience there. These licensed producers are armed to grow 2 plants, and there's a third that I will also discuss. The first plant, just a bit of background, guys. I'm going to discuss the 2 different plants, and then we'll get into the medical compounds. I have yet to say anything about CBD or THC. Sativa plants were initially discovered in South America. They are big, they are tall. If you ever see a fully grown sativa plant and you look at the base of the plant, it's almost as thick as the end of a baseball bat. You won't be able to pull it out of the ground with your hands. They're strong, strong plants. They actually kind of grew feral in a lot of places in South America, and that's how they were initially discovered. Farmers were trying to keep them off their land. And a few farmers reported that they plucked some of these strange smelling buds from these plants and they would chew on them while they were working. And they all reported a better mood and less back pain, and they weren't as tired. So again, that's generally where the plant sativa started. They are known to be uplifting and energizing. The memory trick for a sativa plant is sativa S for sun. Again, it can be uplifting. The next plant that they grow is called the indica plant. Now, indica, we remember it this way, indica, in the couch. They're supposed to be calming and relaxing. Okay, so again, and I'm not talking about CBD or THC yet, but the indica plant was discovered in Asia. Remembering that the sativa plants are big and strong and tall, the indica plants are short and stubby, and they're actually kind of sensitive plants. Their properties, again, are the opposite of the sativas. They're calming and relaxing, where the sativas are uplifting and energizing, but the 2 plants are genetically identical. Okay, so that's important to know. Genetically identical, but phenotypically different. And what I mean by that is that they have different characteristics. Phenotypes are what distinguish the differences between all species, including humans. So phenotypes will choose the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, our bone density. There's a lot of different factors within any species that are differentiated by phenotypes. And again, sativas and indicas are identical genetically, but phenotypically different, and that's the difference between them. I mentioned a third plant. Sometimes a licensed producer will want the strengths of a sativa plant, and they'll want the properties of an indica plant. So they will cross-pollinate them, and they'll call that a hybrid. I'm not a botanist. I don't know too much about how it occurs, but I know that most medical cannabis providers will have a hybrid version of their plants just to ensure that a patient will have access to that as well. Medical compounds, drum roll. This is what we've all been waiting for, right? This is where the important stuff can come forward. Now, when I first started giving these presentations, there wasn't many people who knew what CBD was, right? I have to take a long pause on this slide to describe, CBD. This is cannabidiol. This is the non-psychoactive component of medical cannabis. Fast forward 2.5 years, feels like it's been a lot longer, but now everybody knows what CBD is. Now there isn't a person that doesn't understand what CBD is when I have these presentations. So I've just put a list of some of the things we've seen in clinic and what we've recorded as the benefits of CBD for us to discuss here. If I had to choose a couple off this list that were probably the more important ones, I would say the analgesic effect. It's a fancy way of saying painkiller. And the anti-inflammatory properties. These are very, very important as well. One of the main conditions we see in clinic is the simple run-of-the-mill osteoarthritis, right? The painful knee or the bad back or the bad neck. I've even seen a lot of hip discomfort as well in clinic. And again, this is a person who through time has worn down the joint, and you have site inflammation. When things get too close, there's pain there and there's inflammation. And that site inflammation, if left untreated, can graduate into systemic inflammation. And now you have pain that started in the hip, but you also have a headache and your shoulder hurts again. You can't understand why. And again, that's all from systemic inflammation. And again, the anti-inflammatory properties of CBD play a strong role for those patients. Another one here that's also important is an anti-anxiolytic, right? Mental health. We do see a lot of the pediatric population coming to our clinic now because of the epilepsy that can be controlled with CBD as well. Again, it is an anti-epileptic. It can help that way as well. Remembering, guys, CBD does not have a psychoactive effect, and to translate that into more simple terms, it will not get anybody quote unquote high, as the kids call it these days. That's not going to be a risk factor for CBD. The side effects of high use CBD are an upset stomach or diarrhea or a headache. And again, these are all things that we've seen in clinic and documented and recorded at a very low percentage. The next chemical compound that comes off of the plant is called THC. So this is the infamous one. This is the one that people watch out for. This is the one that sometimes people are scared of when they come into clinic. Guys, I want to make this very, very clear. THC plays a very important role.
No, I have no volume.
You have no volume?
Sorry, guys, I'm getting a little bit of background noise. So THC is not the component that most people are started with when it comes to medical cannabis. But again, it can be a very, very helpful tool in the physician's belt when we discuss medical cannabis for certain cases. Remembering, it also is a powerful anti-inflammatory, okay? It also helps a lot with insomnia. A sleep disturbance is probably the #1 complaint when it comes to any chronic condition. It is the primary psychoactive component of medical cannabis, but that is dose dependent. It's very important for people to understand. I always say the dose is the drug, not the chemical component, because recreational cannabis has its starting point and medical cannabis stays beneath it. And we ensure that our patients do not feel the ill effects of THC. In fact, if people do feel them, well, then that's a miss. We have failed that patient. We need to go back and discuss the treatment plan and their doses and how we can lower and still help. Our goal is to attain the lowest therapeutic dose when it comes to medical cannabis. And again, I tell you now from experience, THC is a very helpful component. On this list is also appetite stimulating, antiemetic. In a world in which everybody is trying to lose weight, why would we ever want to stimulate the appetite with THC? And the answer to that is it has its place. Medical oncology is one of those places, right? People who go through chemotherapy or radiation will have a complete loss of appetite. In fact, will suffer from a lot of nausea. And again, a little bit of THC can reignite that appetite for them a little bit and also help with some of the nausea they're experiencing. Also, there's anorexia and bulimia. People who struggle to have an appetite can find some assistance when it comes to THC. Trichomes. I thought this was an interesting slide. Maybe not all will agree, but these tiny little projections. Oh, let me rewind. This is a microscopic photograph of the plant. So cannabis has a little over 100 different chemical compounds that come off of it, 100 different types of cannabinoids, and they're all housed in these tiny little oily projections called trichomes. This is important to know because this means that a plant that is 97% carbohydrate based has a small percentage of fat that grows on it, and that fat soluble medication or fat soluble chemical compound that comes off of the plant has receptors in our body, and it can affect the human body that way because, again, it is fat soluble. So at the end of the day, these big fancy licensed producers and all of these numerous medical cannabis clinics are all trying to harness this tiny little microscopic fat that comes from the plant. A licensed producer will take 5 to 10 grams of a bud from a particular plant, and they will crush it and they will heat it at a very high rate, and they're basically melting off these trichomes. And when they melt them off, they attain a small concentrated amount of it. And then Health Canada tells them they must dilute that with healthy oil. They now choose medium chain triglycerides, or MCT oil, which is a coconut derivative, which is one of the healthier oils that we can ingest. And they mix it with the oils that come off of the cannabis plant. That allows the medication to be unmixable. So now you have an even amount of medication throughout that oil. And again, remembering that it's fat-based and you're mixing a fat with a fat, you can't unmix it. So again, it's the safest method in which we can consume medical cannabis. So we've talked about THC and CBD, we've talked about sativas and indicas, and now we're going to discuss what is called the endocannabinoid system. This is a system in our body that is already in place. There are several different ways we can plug cannabinoids into this system. And starting from the top, we have cannabis or cannabinoids. These are the ones that are being put into the body from either a plant base or a synthetic base. Endocannabinoids, the word endo in Latin just means endogenous, which means us. Endocannabinoids are the ones that our body naturally produces. And then there are synthetic cannabinoids as well, and these are the nabilone and Sativex. That's what they're known for. For any given reason, we have observed in clinic that both nabilone and Sativex, not to be confused with sativa plants, Sativex is the synthetic version of THC, they don't respond well for long. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes you have a patient who will come in and they've started on 20 milligrams of Sativex. They come in a week later and say, it worked for 3 days and it hasn't worked for the past 2. Well, the physician will say, okay, well, maybe we need a higher dose. We'll go from 20 to 40. And the same will occur. They get about a 1 to 48 hours, 72 hours of benefit, and then that falls off again. It is quick to be tolerated for some reason that we do not understand. When it comes to the cannabis plants and what they produce, they're called phytocannabinoids. So the ones that come from plants are called phytocannabinoids, and they tend to work far better in the system. We have observed small percentages of tolerance, and again, we can easily combat that, and we teach our patients how to do that on a daily basis. For reference, it's important to know that CB1 is the THC receptor, and CB2 is the CBD receptor. So if we look at this, they are everywhere. And when something is widely found throughout the body, we use a fancy medical term, we call it ubiquitous. Again, just a fancy way of saying they're everywhere. And this is probably the reason why medical cannabis can be used in so many different conditions, which is why we have such a massive variety of patients in our clinic. This is another slide just further breaking down the systems that are involved and the receptors that can be found. So obviously, first and foremost, at the very top of the list is the brain, right? Upper motor neuron is your brain and spinal cord. Lower motor neurons will be your peripheral nervous system. So everything after the brain and spinal cord will be considered the lower motor neurons or the peripheral nervous system. But if we look closely on the brain, there's both CB1 and CB2 receptors. So everybody always thinks that THC affects the brain and CBD affects the body. It's not necessarily true. CBD alone can affect people's mental health in a positive way. THC can help with sleep in the central nervous system, and a physician may choose to go that route depending on what the sleep disturbance is caused by. So if you think about it, I'm going to talk about chronic pain as an example for the brain. Chronic pain is consistent signaling that goes to the brain. It doesn't allow us to really think of anything else. So a patient who is suffering from, let's just say, fibromyalgia is lying in bed struggling with pain, and they're just constantly getting messages not allowing them to rest. So CBD can play a role in helping control that anxiety that comes with chronic pain. THC will help initiate sleep. So again, they play important roles, and both these things can be discussed at a doctor's appointment. Other important organs to recognize here would be probably the large intestine. If I had it my way, that would probably take up half of this slide. The GI is one of the areas of largest free radical damage in our body. Every time we eat, we're causing a lot of cell turnover. So the large intestines need some antioxidant help. CBD is a very, very good antioxidant for the digestive system and also the central nervous system. There are set conditions that we see for the large intestines or the digestive tract in general as well. There is ulcerative colitis, there's Crohn's disease, celiac is another big one that we see. And sometimes the patients will say, well, I still react the same way to those foods, but instead of being sick for 10 days or 15 days after a poor reaction, when I use CBD, I'm only really feeling poor about 48 hours after. So it's really helping with my recovery. And again, these are things we hear. The immune system is also another big one here, guys. Way at the bottom, almost off the slide. But the immune system is where we find a lot of benefits when it comes to rheumatology or autoimmune conditions as well. I'm assuming there will be many questions about this slide, so I'll come back to it at the end and we can stop on it. This photo is every medical student's nightmare. This is where we spend a lot of time understanding the exact physiology of the human body. In this particular case, we're looking at the pre and the postsynaptic cleft. I assume in this group, this picture will not be so foreign to us. Sometimes when I do these presentations, a hand will go up and people will say, well, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Is that an elbow? Is that a knee? Guys, this is the pre and postsynaptic cleft. This is how the neurological system communicates. Okay, so there are receptors in place. And what I want to make very clear before I leave this slide, because to me it's boring, is that there's 2-AG and anandamide. Those are the two chemical components that our body naturally produces in the endocannabinoid system. And there is CB1 receptors that also affect the central nervous system that act in a very similar way. Again, in this particular photo, it's showing THC, but CBD also has receptors in both the pre and postsynaptic cleft. So it can affect how we perceive pain. It can also help with the inflammatory process that follows pain. And we can also kind of address some of the other symptomatologies that follow chronic conditions. So when it comes to the endocannabinoid system, these are, again, some of the things that we have seen that are benefiting our patients. It comes down to inflammation, pain, digestion, sleep. Bone density is an interesting one. Mood, stress regulation, and even reproduction. These are the conditions that we have documented well in clinic. Chronic pain being at the top of the list. Neuropathic pain second to that. When it comes to ALS, most people do not discuss pain, but they do report pain, and about 60% from my readings, I've been as high as 70 times as well. So pain is of neuropathic origin when it happens with ALS, from my understanding, and again, cannabis does play a role with that. Fibromyalgia is after that, MS, an autoimmune condition in which the central nervous system is being attacked. I've already discussed epilepsy and PTSD with you guys. We have anxiety and stress. Insomnia is huge. Right? I think that anytime you walk into any room, it's fair to assume that more than half the people in that room aren't sleeping properly. And that's, again, something we hear in clinic. And some people say, I started taking CBD for my migraines, but I've never slept better. So even when I don't have a migraine, I'd like to continue. And the doctor turns to them and says, that's okay with me, as long as you check in every 3 months and we're on the understanding that this is an as-needed medication when you need it. You can stop if you wish. You can use regularly if you wish as well. So this is an additional slide that I put in here regarding ALS. Again, when I did a lot of my homework with this stuff, I went back into my medical books and then I read up on what was new. And we're still struggling, guys, obviously. I mean, I don't need to spend too much time stating that to this audience, but I've just put some of the facts that I've come across. The second most common neuro disease, second to Alzheimer's, very high incidence in Caucasians and slightly higher in males is also what I found. There's a sporadic and hereditary route. I'm looking forward to the questioning portion of this because I'm hoping that you guys can even fill this in for me a little bit further. But again, I've found, again, from my recent readings that it's 90% sporadic and about 10% hereditary. Average age of onset between 40 and 55, but seen as young as 25. And now we're kind of circling back to how medical cannabis can play a role with ALS. symptom control, with the sleep disturbances, and obviously with the pain management. I've also added here, from what we have observed in clinic, reduced fasciculations. And again, reduced neuropathic pain is something that we have seen from the ALS patients in our clinic. Now, what does that mean when you see and observe something in a condition like ALS? All that we can do is document. All that we can do is share that information with the next patient that comes in, but we must be very clear. Just because it worked for one person doesn't mean it'll work the same way for everyone. And that is the case for any medication, guys, not just medical cannabis. When medication is released into the market and it has gone through all of the battery of tests that come from the CDC and Health Canada, they still say, these are the side effects that we observed, these are the positive benefits we observed, and within 2 standard deviations of the norm, 90% of people started at this dose. The only difference between medical cannabis and most other medications is that we never got a chance to do the bell curve of the dosing. So to combat that, what we do in our clinic is to start at the lowest possible dose that you can. And I always tell patients this, it's interesting, we're gonna start at a dose that you probably feel nothing. And then we're gonna move up slowly, and once we've attained therapeutic benefit, we might push a little bit further. If it's the same, we'll come back to reduce cost. And that's the method that we use to ensure proper dosing in our clinic. Methods of consumption. This is a big one. Now, initially, and when I say initially, I mean 2.5, 3 years ago, there were only oils that can be used. Okay, so like I explained, the trichomes were being melted off and put into an MCT-based coconut oil, and patients would only have to draw out what was a small oral syringe, and they would measure the dose, and that would go into their mouth. There was a huge conception of, do I put it under my tongue? Is it absorbed under my tongue? No, it is not. Remembering that it is a fat-based medication, the liver is required for digestion. We call that first pass metabolism. And that is what causes the delay or the kick-in for medical cannabis products at times, if they're ingested, if they're edible. So you consume that oil, it goes down into your stomach, over into your intestines, your liver picks that up, stamps it, sends it everywhere. That process takes about 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on that person's metabolism. Once the medication is in your system, it should last anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. Again, I put the longest window of variability. Most people tell us it's about 4 to 6. Sometimes people say it goes past 8. Again, it'll depend on that person's metabolism. Nowadays, we have capsules, which have just been concentrated oils into a capsule, and it's much, much easier to use in that way. Patients are very, very happy about the capsules, and so were we. We had a lot of trouble with, drawing out a dose in public, or people who have arthritis and have trouble getting the bottles open. Now we just move on to capsules. It's much, much easier. I put here, it is important to start low and go slow, which is just, again, referencing our titration methodology. The second form of medical cannabis and the method that can be used is inhalation. Guys, I always take a hard pause when I do this presentation to make it very clear. We do not promote that anybody smoke anything at Apollo, but there are Health Canada approved vaporizers that have the ability to take a dry flower, and you put the dry flower into a unit. This photo is one of them, and that unit will heat the plant to the point of dehydration. That plant will let off a steam or a mist, and you're inhaling a very small amount of steam. That is very different than the recreational vaporizers that are out there, the Juuls or whatever brands that are out there that people are using that are within seconds giving them huge clouds of smoke. Those products are burning plastics, and they have vitamin E acetate in them. And there's a lot of inhaled oil and plastic that goes into the lungs, and that's causing a whole array of problems for people. I can get into that during the questions if someone wishes. The condition has been called popcorn lung, and I can explain why. But what's important to remember is the only difference between vaporizing the correct way and ingesting is that vaporizing will act much, much faster. There are certain patients that benefit from this, and there are certain patients that absolutely need it. And those patients would be our veterans, right? PTSD is a condition in which a person's mindset is in a war zone. They don't have 1.5 to 2 hours to wait. They grab their vaporizer and they turn it on. And there's also a misconception that people think as soon as you are vaporizing cannabis, you are using THC. That is not the case. You can attain pure CBD flower and inhale that And again, they unanimously report symptom control. They say that, I'm calm again. I avoided panic attacks this month. I was able to stay away from the unpleasantries of my inner self when I'm going through a struggle with PTSD. And again, these are things that we've documented and recorded, and they come back to us, and their families come back to us, and they're all very, very thankful. And they say, thank you for giving my husband back or my wife back to me. He wasn't himself, or he wasn't herself when she had come back. So this is helping. And again, I put here, it's within 5 minutes, as quick as it comes. It also leaves a little bit faster. It's about 1 to 4 hours before the efficacy is passed. I've added a couple slides for terpenes. Guys, this is something that a lot of patients are telling us in clinic. It's very interesting. Remembering back to the trichomes that grow off of medical cannabis, those tiny little fat projections, because they are fat, they can have particles settle on them, dust settles on them, pollen will settle on them. So if a medical cannabis plant or any cannabis plant is growing next to a lavender field, chances are that it will adapt to some of its environment. It can pull in some lavender pollen, and that becomes a part of the plant's genetics. It's very interesting. So plants that have a bit of the lavender terpene profile to them have a calmer, relaxing feel. A terpene, I should explain, is any scent or aroma or flavor that comes from all plant matter. So if anyone has a basil plant at home and they pluck a leaf off of that and they smell it, you are smelling the terpene profile of that plant. Cannabis has recorded all of these different terpenes within the plant. So linalool was the one that I was referring to, lavender. That is, again, it can be used to have calming effects. It's a bit sedating. It helps with insomnia naturally. Chirophyllene is another one. That one's a little bit hard to say, but that is the one that comes off of black cloves, spicy, woody scent to it. Again, these are all things that we document in clinic. Pinene is a very popular one as well. This one's an interesting one. We have patients who use CBD with a high level of pinene, and they come back and say, hey, guess what? I don't need my asthma inhaler nearly as much anymore. I feel that it really dilates my lungs and I can breathe a little better when I use my CBD. Well, we have to listen. We have to document. And that is what we have done here. There will never be a time when someone goes into a clinic or a bit of an acute setting or an emergency setting and says, I need a shot of linalool or I'm not going to make it. It doesn't have direct medical value, but it's helping and we're paying attention, guys. Side effects. This is another hot topic when it comes to these presentations. A lot of people love to ask me, well, I heard so-and-so tried it and they went crazy and they were never the same person again. That is not what happens when it comes to medical cannabis. This is a very, very controlled and monitored situation that people get into when it comes to medical cannabis. All of these side effects that are seen here are from the use of high THC. I pause for dramatic effect, remembering that CBD side effects are an upset stomach or a headache. These are all from high THC. And again, of course, dry mouth is on the top of the list here. Drowsiness, well, I thought about adding this one and I took it off and then I put it back on. I thought, is it really a side effect if we're using THC for sleep assistance and a patient is feeling drowsy? Isn't that what the goal was? But again, I put it there in case someone didn't want to feel drowsy. THC would have to be avoided, and that's common practice. Some of the more uncommon side effects are a panic attack, paranoia, or psychosis. Guys, these are so uncommon that we hardly ever see them, and if it is something that is of danger to the patient, we protect the patient. The only time a patient would suffer from a panic attack, paranoia, or psychosis is if they were predisposed to it. If they were diagnosed with schizophrenia, if they were diagnosed with bipolar, if there's a family history of schizophrenia. All of these questions are asked and documented and recorded by the doctor before a prescription is even put into place. So again, there's the old tale of someone using cannabis and never being the same is not true. Mental disease is just not well known enough. And a lot of people who are struggling with mental disease will go into alternatives to try and attain some form of benefit. And it's not always a healthy practice, but these things can occur. Any stimulant can cause psychosis in a person who is a schizophrenic. This is also something that I wanted to add and discuss with you guys. I in a sneaky way added the opioid overdose. And I wanted to compare and contrast to cannabis because the opioid crisis is no secret. Guys, I don't want to throw shadow at modern medicine, but at a time, opioids were helping so many different conditions that physicians started to write it more and more. And unfortunately, they're incredibly addictive. And when the doctor would say no to a person, well, they were left with alternative methods to attain it. It wasn't ever safe to begin with. The reason why opioids can be so dangerous is because they do have receptors in our respiratory center, our breathing center. It is considered a neurological suppressant. There was a time in which a lot of movie stars and famous people were passing away from opioids, and that's because the physician would give them the prescription and tell them, please do not use this with any other neurological suppressants. And they'd say, yeah, sure, doc, don't worry about it. They would take their medication, and then they would sit and have a couple glasses of wine, and the next thing you know, you have not just one neurological suppressant, you have two. And they would go to sleep, and they would simply stop breathing due to opioids having receptors in the breathing center. And it was very sad. That is called an accidental overdose. The comparison and contrast is that THC does not have receptors in the breathing centers of our brain, and there is no way that it can slow down our breathing. Again, very important to this group, very important for everybody to understand that. There has never been a reported case of death due to the use of cannabis. Addiction. I think some of the questions that came our way before this presentation were asking about addiction, so I brought forth this slide. I absolutely hate this slide, but I had to give you guys something. If we look at the bottom here, it's very dated. It came out of Washington, D.C. in 2001, but this was a study that was done, and it was respectful enough for us to post it here. Cannabis is reported to have about a 9% dependency rate. Now, dependency in medicine is described as somebody who requires a substance or they are at risk from a physical standpoint. If you take alcohol away from an alcoholic, there's a chance that they could suffer from a heart attack, seizures, renal dysfunction, they want to call it. So regardless, there's lots of different things that can happen if you remove the substance. With cannabis, there are none of those things. 9% of people said they were living better with it and they wanted it again. So, and again, this list is talking about people who smoked cannabis. It has nothing to do with medical cannabis. I hate that we're even in the same arena as some of the substances in this slide, you know, heroin and cocaine and tranquilizers. Those are very heavy street drugs. But at the top of the list is tobacco, which is readily available at a very young age in this country. And then, of course, alcohol, which we celebrate with. And that's, you know, quite a very, very toxic substance when you think about it. Alcohol kills people. There are several hundred deaths in Toronto every month based on alcohol dependency. Again, under the radar, right? And we're okay with it because it's been around for a while, but cannabis has all this stigma. So it's important to know the facts. This is another one that I've added here because I thought it was very interesting to share with you guys. One of our physicians came to us from a substance abuse recovery program, and he said his patients were all unanimously asking him more about medical cannabis. So he decided to join the Apollo team, the Apollo family, and he wanted to learn more. And he started paying attention to the medications that were dropping off the list when patients were using medical cannabis. And these are some of the results that we found. So again, alcohol substitution more than 40%. That's an enormous number. Illicit drug use, this is what he saw in his private clinic, not us, but about 26% of those patients were able to substitute cannabis. The big one, the most important one that we like to talk about is obviously prescription medications. More than 65% were able to reduce prescription medications with the use of medical cannabis. And of course, you have these buds in the background that we now understand. The reason why they're fuzzy and sticky is because of those tiny little trichomes. That brings me to the end, guys. I'll stop here because I anticipate questions and maybe some discussion. So let me get back to everybody. Can you see me, Kim? I can see you.
I can't see you. I can still see your screen.
Okay, what about now?
Perfect. We're good. Thank you so much, Arash. Okay, so we have a few questions that have been coming in. If people have any more questions, please type them in now before we end the presentation. We will follow up with you, though, and your clinic if there is any other specific questions clients have. So one of the questions was, how can cannabis help muscular atrophy and not neurological?
So muscular,
a lot of clients suffer from muscular issues, and it's not neurological.
Yeah, of course. I mean, let's look at a big picture, okay? ALS is a loss of communication with the central nervous system. Let's leave it at that. Any muscle that is not used over a period of time will atrophy, okay? I have to be 100% honest with you guys. Medical cannabis does not play a role when it comes to the physiological atrophy of muscle. We don't, I can't even sit here and connect it in any way, shape, or form. We do not play a role that way. The best combat for atrophy is physiotherapy, guys. You got to use that muscle to build that muscle. And of course, I understand that's not always available, but that is the combat to atrophy. Good question.
Can you tell us some of the benefits for someone who has bulbar onset symptoms?
Yeah, remembering that almost 80% of all ALS will graduate into bulbar symptoms. This is something that we must discuss with ALS patients, right? If a patient is having trouble swallowing or trouble breathing, and medical cannabis can help relax that nerve, or THC at a microdose can help as a muscle relaxant, then we can say that we're some way benefiting that patient. It would have to be a trial and error basis. We would start again at the lowest dose possible and move up slowly to see if there is a benefit. Sometimes they come back to us and say it's still the same, and we will have a very serious conversation and say, well, we understand that we have tried and this is not a treatment option for you. But it would be with the relaxation of muscles, and that's the only role we can play.
Does cannabis help with anxiety around, people who have an ALS diagnosis, but also people who are suffering from severe COPD?
COPD, yeah. If a patient comes in with anxiety and COPD, you better believe the physician is checkmarking no inhaled forms of cannabis. Okay, we're going to be ingestible only. CBD plays a role as an anti-inflammatory. COPD is inflamed airways that have been clogged up, and now we're going the other opposite direction where you can't get oxygen out. So to not bore us with all the details, COPD patients do come to our clinic, and we do give them CBD, and then ingestible forms of a combination of both CBD and THC can help with the anxiety, right? Remembering that both anxiety and depression are two conditions from the same area of the brain. One is an overcompensation and one is an under, but they're definitely linked, right? THC can help kind of regulate people. We put people back into what we call homeostasis, which is balance. And that's not always easy to find. It is dose dependent, but I promise you will find it.
Okay, great. Is there medical cannabis that's available in edibles?
Yeah, it's funny. Edibles is an interesting term. People are thinking now, well, edibles are out, so where's the cookies and the chocolates and the brownies and all that fun stuff? You guys remember, cannabis is a fat-soluble medication, so when you consume a brownie that has cannabis versus a capsule that has medical cannabis, or an oil, they all get digested the same way, right? They're still first-pass metabolism. A lot of the licensed producers now have chocolates. A lot of them have cookies. The only kind of restriction that Health Canada has put on these licensed producers when it comes to the fun, quote unquote, edibles is that they must be broken down by dose. In the past, you would get someone telling you, hey, here's a cookie, eat half of it, don't eat the whole thing, it's too much. Well, how do you know the medication isn't all sitting on one side of that cookie? You eat half of it, you feel one way, you eat the other half of it, you feel completely different. So Health Canada has said that is not allowed. You have to give individually sized, dose-dependent edibles. So I guess the answer to your question is yes, they do exist.
Okay. I think there will be some people on the call that will be quite happy to know that it comes in chocolate form.
Yes.
So one of the questions we're having is who pays for medical cannabis? And then the second question was, did OHIP cover that cost?
Good questions. There's a couple there. So first and foremost, your entire process with Apollo is completely free. All right, it is OHIP covered, and it doesn't matter what province you live in right now. We are able to see patients from coast to coast, like mentioned. So the 6 steps that I showed are all covered. The medication is still considered private, so that is on the patient, unfortunately. We are at the top of our lungs with Health Canada. We want this stuff covered just as much as patients do. We do have a lot of different avenues that we can travel if a patient is looking for some form of financial relief. A lot of these companies offer compassionate pricing. There are certain companies that are higher priced or lower priced. We can find out exactly what would best suit the individual. But as it stands now, it is private. It'll range in price anywhere from $25 to $100 a month, depending on what the patient needs.
Is there a typical time frame? One of the things you made reference to a few times was low and slow.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a typical time frame for a patient to start feeling like they've really reached that perfect dose?
Yes. It usually takes us anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to learn. And what we do with our patients is they have their first appointment, and then we draw up a treatment plan that's going to slowly increase their dose with a phone number to our call center that's open 7 days a week if they need it. And we don't want anyone feeling abandoned. And we always tell patients after their first visit, look, you've been here a while. This is a long process. The one thing you must remember when you leave is if you feel any side effects, stop immediately and call us. Okay, there is no weaning schedule with medical cannabis, but because it is fat soluble, it can take time to build up in the system, and we see those benefits anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks out. A lot of people are like wondering, I took that one dose, how come I'm not okay? Guys, you cannot attain a benefit from any medication with a single dose. Right? We have to try over time.
So we have a question from a client who has been taking cannabis overnight for sleeping. And I'm just wondering, is there a benefit of increasing that to take it during the day? So what's the benefit, the difference between maybe regular dosing versus time-specific dosing?
The benefits would be based on the half-life of the medication. Okay, so let's say someone is taking, and actually, I'm going to give you a real case. We had a patient who came in who had really, really bad osteoarthritis in both knees. Okay, former soccer player. So he says, my knees are killing me. I take CBD first thing in the morning, and it really helps me until about 1 o'clock. So after 1 o'clock, I'm kind of just left with my pain. And in the evening, I take my sleeping dose, and that really helps as well. Well, what he has inadvertently discovered is that it takes him about 4 to 6 hours for it to come out of his system. So his 8 a.m. dose is done by about 1 o'clock. So I asked him, well, why don't we take another dose at 12:30? He goes, I didn't know I could do that. I said, well, if you're feeling the pain again, that means that the medication has come out of your system. The advantage to using it more regularly is symptom control and more hours of anti-inflammation or anti-inflammatory properties of cannabis. So good question. You can extend daytime products in the day, and then obviously your evening product will be your evening product.
One of the words that you use, and I'm going to try to say it, efficacy. Explain that to people.
Yeah, efficacy is where we attain a clinical benefit. Okay, if something is ineffective, it's not high efficacy. That means that it's not affecting anything. It's not helpful. But we try to attain the lowest therapeutic dose and the highest efficacy, which means we want to use as little as possible with the maximum effect. And the only way you can do that is to get to a dose where you're feeling something, push a little past that, and see if there's any more benefit. If not, you come back to the lower dose. Sometimes, and very rarely, patients will call us and say, well, I tried one evening capsule and it didn't work, so I went to 2 and it was okay. I went to 3 and that was not pleasant for me. I didn't like how I felt. Well, I will say, well, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith, we now know what we don't want to feel. Okay, we will go back to a lower dose that is more effective, has a higher efficacy for you. I hope I answered that.
One of the questions we had is a little bit more complicated, but a person who received a prescription for medical cannabis and picked that up from their pharmacy, but feels like they've never been given any actual instructions. Where do people turn for that support?
You have to go back to the clinic. That is our number one problem with medical cannabis, unfortunately. I am in the industry myself, and I see it all the time. We have patients that come to our clinic and say, well, I went to so-and-so, and they told me to use this, but that's all I heard, and they haven't talked to me since. Well, like a doctor's office, if they give you a prescription and you call and say this isn't working yet, the doctor will say, well, we got to give it 4 more weeks, or we got to give it 2 more weeks. So if it didn't work, stop, and I'll come back in for a follow-up. We treat cannabis the exact same. The problem is that there are a lot of clinics that are opening that are not correctly situated to support the patient base. So it's unequivocally important for patients to understand that your support system is just as important as access to the medication, right? So if I was a patient that had nowhere to call for a medication, odds are I'll stop using it. And then the whole process is undermined by a lack of education. So I promise you, actually, let me rewind. That person should go back to the clinic that prescribed to them to have their questions answered. And if not, they can always give us a call. Our educators.
Can people, if they've had not a great experience, it's not an issue to switch to another clinic? If they,
not at all.
Like they're not getting the support they need at one clinic, they could go to another clinic, and for example, your clinic being one of them.
I encourage that. Anytime someone doesn't get what they need from a family doctor, they're quick to change, right? And sometimes people think, well, this physician didn't treat me right, or this nurse practitioner didn't treat me right. I want to go somewhere else, and they go somewhere else and they attain an entirely different experience. I'm not trying to say we're walking this golden line here, but in actuality, if a medical facility is not fulfilling the needs of the patient, they shouldn't.
The next question we had was around cannabis salves, so creams and lotions, and the benefit around that.
Yeah, topicals. So big hot topic. It's interesting to say, but I'll do my best to explain it. When we think about our bodies, we always tend to look past the skin, right? One of our biggest and most important organs. It is a fat-soluble protective layer. Cannabis is fat-soluble. Yes, it will absorb. Yes, it will affect the joint that it is put on. That being said, we have seen benefit from smaller, more peripheral joints, right? So a bad elbow, wrist, ankles, maybe a knee. But if we're talking about back pain, shoulder pain, or hip pain, anything that's deeper, you got to go systemic. And like I explained, when it comes to osteoarthritis, chronic pain, which is more than 70% of what we see in clinic, any site inflammation will graduate into systemic inflammation. And it's important to address systemic inflammation with the systemic anti-inflammatory. I love topicals, and I love how people are gravitating towards them. Well, they're saying, well, I don't want to use cannabis. I just want to use it on my joint and kind of get away with it. That's great. Give it a shot. But I promise you, you will probably attain a better benefit if using it systemically.
This has been so helpful in terms of the education for all of us listening. So we know that there will be follow-up questions. We are going to pass them on to you for sure. We appreciate everyone listening today, but we also really appreciate the information. It was very unbiased and really general. So if you have a question and you want to talk to a medical professional at your clinic, please call. You can call any clinic, but these guys are offering to answer questions and help give some direction. It seems like there's some people that have been posting some comments about that they just feel very lost. And so it sounds like from listening to you speak is that it's really important that people feel well supported in this in terms of the decision making around what works for them. And we've heard a lot of times, I think the one comment that was made is that the two things, one is low and slow is very important, but also it takes time. And it's not just let's do the first dose and be done with things. It doesn't work for people.
Yeah.
One benefits right away, but for long-term use, that's not going to be something that's going to be
exactly. That's exactly right, Kim. And again, I always draw on clinical examples. So we have certain patients that tell us, my condition is really bad in the winter, right? So from end of October to March, I am able to stay afloat with medical cannabis. I don't need it in the summer. And that's brilliant. I love to hear that. That means that patient is in complete control of their health and their understanding of the signals that are coming to them from their body. Other people will tell me, well, I tried it twice and it didn't work. And again, it's not an antibiotic. We have to use it for a long period of time. We have to understand what you do for after 90 days. And the support systems that are lacking for people discourage that. So I don't want to, sound like a bit of a broken record, but the support system is just as important as access. One more thing I wanted to quickly add, as you mentioned, the pandemic has kind of slowed down some of the more research initiatives that we've wanted to do. ALS is unequivocally important. And if we do have those patients, what we do is we kind of mark them in our EMR. We attain their permission to follow them from a category standpoint. I will give you a number, you won't be written down names, but I want to know what we are helping with and what your symptoms were and how long we treat from the date that you came to us compared to the date of diagnosis moving forward. Again, that information will be way more important to us down the line than any kind of commercial, posting here. So I'm happy to hear you said it was objective and kind of detached from the commercial side of things, because our goal is to turn the dial of human understanding. We want to know if this thing will be something that we can continue to grow on. So
as we were wrapping up, we're getting rapid questions coming in because people realize we're finishing. So one of the questions is, what's the best method of ingestion for someone who can't tolerate solid foods and might need a feeding tube? Is there and I don't know if you want to address that in this group setting or you'd like to just do that.
No,
on an individual one-on-one.
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I'm just thinking about it in my head a little bit. I would have to know more about the individual, but my understanding is if there's a GI tube, then we would want to avoid oils and go to a very small capsule. Again, I don't know if they were able to take that capsule via the GI tube. We'd have to do some more investigation. But my thinking is less is better for that individual and at a concentrated dose. So I would want to have 20 milligrams of CBD at night to start, and only at night, and then we can graduate into daytime use, but we have to understand what it'll do first. So yes is the short answer.
Okay. Can you juice cannabis?
Yeah, you can. The process of juicing is interesting. Some people will juice it cold, and then you have unactivated cannabis, which just means you have to consume a lot more of it. Some people will juice it and follow some of the cooking recipes. A lot of helpful people on YouTube. The process is called decarboxylation, which is what licensed producers are doing before they send the medication out. The only difference between people doing it at home and people getting it from a licensed producer is that the licensed producer is Health Canada certified. They have an exact set, precise dose. Whereas if you're doing it at home, you're kind of guessing. Now, I've seen a tremendous number of people benefit from home cooking recipes and saying, like, you know, it's controlling my sleep and my fibro again, so thank you. I just don't know how much I'm using. I'm making the same recipe week in and week out, and sometimes it works better than others. I left it in the oven for an extra 5 minutes, and that's less effective now. Again, those are problems that some people want. Most people will think a licensed producer can prepare it for me, and that's just the easier way.
Does a person need a referral from their GP to work with you or any other clinic?
I don't know about other clinics. For us, we do not require a referral anymore. This is so interesting. Some patients were telling us, well, I don't want my family doctor to know. Can I come in anyways? And we'd say, no, we need a referral. And then we decided one day, it's not fair for us to say no to people. If they're reaching out for an alternative for their health, we need to say yes. So we opened our doors to walk-ins, and it just, people flooded in. And then we got a whole bunch of enthusiasts saying, well, now I want my family doctor to know. He told me not to search this out, but I've been able to get rid of my sleeping med and some of my pain meds, and he should know. So we're happy to send a consult note with the full treatment plan highlighted to any physician that refers to us. We prefer it, but we don't have to have it. I always say the more minds involved, the better. The bigger the circle of care, the more care is involved. So.
And the last question is, where is your clinic?
So we have 5 brick and mortar locations in the greater area of Toronto. So I don't know if people are all from Ontario, but we start in Aurora, we go down to North York, then we have a couple of locations downtown and then out west as well. But with the current pandemic in place, all of our appointments are over the phone or virtual. So you would call, you would be given an appointment within 48 hours, and then you would have it from the comfort of your own home.
So that can be anywhere in Ontario. Someone could be referred to your clinic.
Anywhere in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, anywhere in Canada. We have patients all over the country.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're done because I think people will continue to send stuff in. But I really appreciate it, Arish. Like, this was awesome and so helpful for people. Thank you everyone for attending, and I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll happily answer those.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. You guys want to end with a big token of gratitude. It's always great to connect when we're also disconnected.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.